Coming up on this episode, what to make of Mike Dunleavy Jr.'s press conference on Monday ahead of draft and free agency. Plus, are the Warriors about to trade for 9-time All-Star Paul George? All the facts and hypotheticals in what would be a blockbuster move. Yes, welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. Late Tuesday afternoon here for me in Australia. This episode will be out bright and early Tuesday morning for those of you in America. Something big could be on the horizon for the Golden State Warriors in what is set to be a pivotal week or two for the franchise. Have it all covered here on the channel and, of course, over on bluemanhoop.com as well. First of all, I wanted to jump in and talk about Mike Dunleavy Jr.'s press conference that he did on Monday. Not a whole lot to be taken out of it, to be totally honest. One thing that I will get into that was interesting, but we haven't heard from the Warriors for a while, so nonetheless, it was certainly fascinating to hear what Mike Dunleavy Jr. had to say ahead of draft and free agency. First of all, the comments regarding a potential trade in the coming weeks, where he basically answered by saying he's a player development guy. He doesn't see that the improvement in the Warrior roster has to solely come externally, that the Warriors with Jonathan Kuminga, Brandon Podziemski, Trace Jackson-Davis, Moses Moody, they have got the young talent in there to be able to develop internally, and that they don't necessarily have to make a trade in the next couple of weeks, which I think angered and frustrated a lot of Warrior fans who think, hey, we just missed the playoffs. We have a 36-year-old Stephen Curry who's still close enough to his prime where we should be in contention. This team needs to make a trade. My answer to that, I understand the frustration and the anger. My answer to this is that everything that Mike Dunleavy Jr. essentially said in this press conference should be taken with a grain of salt. This is a guy that 12 months ago, almost just over 12 months ago now, said that they wanted Jordan Poole for at least the next 4 years, then turned around and traded him just days later. This is something that is pretty standard for general managers to give straightforward answers, not give too much away, be very coy this time of year. Because at the end of the day, if Mike Dunleavy Jr. comes out and says, hey, you know what, we need to make a trade the next week or two, then all of a sudden that completely ruins their stance in trade negotiations with other teams, because all of a sudden the Warriors appear desperate because they've stated publicly that they need to make a trade. He's not going to say that. If you say that also, it's going to create a lot of angst for your players, which even for the players that aren't traded and remain with the franchise, could cause a disconnect there, could impact the relationship in some way. So, like, as much as fans are frustrated and angry about his comments, that is a standard answer, standard response that a general manager is going to have. He's going to appear to back his own players and appear that, hey, you know what, we've got enough on the roster where we can improve rather than necessarily having to make a big trade. Because if he says he wants to make a big trade, well, then how does he look if he doesn't pull off that big trade, or if he pulls off what the fans consider a bad trade? That looks like a failure. He's going to ruin the stance in negotiations with other teams because the franchise will appear desperate, and he's going to create angst among the players. Like, he's just not going to come out and say, oh, you know what, we need to make a trade. That's not going to happen. So first of all, let's get that off the chest. No need to be frustrated or angry. I can understand that is the initial response from fans who think the Warriors need to make a trade. What Mike Dunleavy Jr. said there does not make any difference on whether the Warriors are going to make a trade or not. That is just what he is saying right now, because that is what every GM is going to say, regardless of what their plans actually are. Secondly, let's go through a few players here. We'll start with Klay, because Klay, he didn't really want to discuss it, and he reiterated that the Warriors want to hold on to Klay, want to re-sign him, which again is going to be the standard response, even if the Warriors actually don't want to re-sign Klay, which would be a surprise, but we'll get into that. He's not going to say, you know what, we're just going to let Klay walk. We actually don't want to re-sign him. He's not going to say that. Of course, he's going to say publicly they want to re-sign him, which could actually be what they want to do, and I hope that's what they want to do. But that is what he's going to say. Reiterated that he wants to keep things private. Failed to clarify whether there is actually an offer on the table for Klay. Of course, we had the Athletic's Anthony Slater report on Saturday that there is no offer on the table currently, and that talks are essentially frozen between the franchise and Klay's management. So he failed to, again, he just said, I want to keep that private between us, Klay, and his management, which is absolutely fair enough. Again, straightforward response that you would expect from that question. Chris Paul was the other one where he went into a little bit more detail on CP3. Quote here said, "We're looking through everything. I think all options are still on the table in terms of keeping Chris. Obviously, there's a scenario where he gets waived. Those conversations, kind of talking it through with him and his camp, we'll keep that to ourselves." So again, reiterating that he wants to, keep that private, but also acknowledging that the Warriors could retain Chris Paul, guarantee that contract. Didn't really mention that he could trade Chris Paul, but again, that is a high possibility. We know that. And the fact that he could also get waived if the Warriors want to save plenty of salary and associated luxury tax payments going in to next season. So not too much there on Chris Paul, nothing more than what we already knew. So blah, blah, blah there. He also said that it would take a lot to move JK, Moody, Pods, and TJD. Again, like, what is he going to do? Come out and say, no, we want to move those guys? Like, again, standard response. This is all kind of, a smart GM knowing what he's doing, being incredibly coy and smart with his words in these kind of press conferences when you've got so many decisions to make ahead in terms of draft free agency and, of course, trade possibilities. The one thing, and most people would have, watched this press conference and walked away and said, I didn't really learn anything new out of that. And absolutely fair enough. Absolutely fair enough. The one tidbit of information that perked my interest, that made me incredibly curious, confused me a little bit, was his comments on Kevon Looney. So, today is currently Tuesday, 25th of June. Yesterday was the guarantee date for Looney's contract. The Warriors have officially guaranteed Kevon Looney's $8 million contract for next season. Of course, they could have waived him, which would have cost $3 million. He'd become an unrestricted free agent. They saved the $5 million in salary and, again, potentially millions more dollars in luxury tax. They've done the right thing here, made the right decision, kept Loon, right? Which, again, I've said for a few episodes now that had to happen, which is good, positive. However, the way in which he answered Tim Kawakami's question on Looney was bizarre. So first of all, he answered, again, with the straightforward answer is, we felt like, he's a great player. We value him as a player. We value him as a teammate. That's why we kept a hold of him, blah, blah, blah. Okay, straightforward answer. However, again, this is what he said at the end of the clip, at the end of the response. He said, as the clock turns into July and free agency, all things are always on the table and available. But for now, we feel good about having him back, and he's a great component of this organization. Just before that as well, he also mentioned that he didn't want to cut Loon and get nothing back for him. Essentially, that would have been the outcome if they'd waived him. They would get nothing back for him. He mentioned that, which I thought was a bit strange. And then, so when you're looking at this quote, why is he mentioning Loon? Sorry, why is he mentioning July and free agency in reference to Loon, who's just had his contract guaranteed? Because really, that should have nothing to do with him. The only thing that Loon would have to do with in July and free agency is if there's a trade. That's the only thing. So why is he mentioning that? He's essentially, this is what he did. He, out of all the things he did in this press conference, which was just straightforward to everything and giving very little away, the only thing he did, which was weird, was he conceded, essentially, that Kevon Looney is going to be a trade candidate. He conceded that. Because why otherwise would he mention Loon and July and free agency in the same sentence? There's just no reason to. Why would he mention that the term for now? For now. So let me go back to that sentence. For now, we feel good about having him back. Why did you mention the two words for now? Why couldn't you say, we feel good about having him back? Why for now? This is just like, we get very little information out of these things. I'm reading between the tea leaves here. This is me speculating. But why? Again, why? Why are you using the words for now? Why are you referencing July and free agency? And the strangest part of it all was the fact that Kawakami in his question did not reference Loon being a trade candidate whatsoever. We have known from reports, right, that there is a very good possibility that if Loon's contract got guaranteed, which it has, that he would become a trade candidate. We understand that. This is not breaking news that Kevon Looney is a trade candidate. But the fact that Mike Dunleavy Jr., the general manager, conceded, essentially he conceded that he's a trade candidate by referencing him in July and free agency when he otherwise would have nothing to do with that period because he's no longer going, contract got guaranteed. He's not a free agent. His future should be solidified now, but it's not. You know why? Because he's a trade candidate. And Mike Dunleavy Jr. has just said as such. Why would he use the term for now? Why couldn't you just say, we feel good about having him back? Very bizarre. And that was the only tidbit of information I looked at and thought, something going on here. Something going on here. And you know what's going on right now? And this is what I'm sure many of you want me to get into. Paul George. It's been brewing. This has been brewing for days on social media. Any of you guys on X/Twitter that follow Warriors-related content whatsoever would know. Paul George the speculation has been rising. Of course, if you go back to last week, we had the report from Shams that said that the Philadelphia 76ers, their interest in PG was significantly waning ahead of free agency. Of course, seen as a strong suitor for PG for weeks now in terms of he's got a $48.8 million player option. He can opt out of that, become an unrestricted free agent. 76ers have the cap space to be able to offer him a max deal. Makes sense. We had that report from Shams saying, no, actually, their interest has significantly waned. Then you have Brian Windhorst come out on Get Up and say that there's a growing likelihood that he opts in to that player option and then requests a trade and tries to work his way out of the Clippers via trade, which is where this all started because now all of a sudden, all right, teams with no cap space can actually get involved in this stuff, e.g. the Warriors, e.g. the Knicks. And now today, or yesterday for those of you if you're waking up Tuesday time in America, now we've got a concrete report. This is the facts. Okay, I want to outline the facts here before we get into the hypotheticals and the speculation. The facts are now that long-time NBA insider Mark Stein, one of the biggest NBA journalists going around, has specifically linked Paul George and the Warriors in the same sentence as a potential trade destination. Also mentioned the Knicks, the Warriors and the Knicks as potential teams that could orchestrate a trade for Paul George. All right. The other fact is, a bit more on the humorous side, is that Patrick Beverley tweeted about it on Monday, stating that it would be tough, would be so tough, quote, if Paul George went to the Warriors. Patrick Beverley, also a free agent himself, 35 years of age, coming off a season where he played for the 76ers and the Bucks. We know, also fact, because Pat Bev said to himself, that the Warriors had interest in Patrick Beverley last February. And just to go off the PG topic here, but a lot of Warrior fans in the replies to that Pat Bev tweet suggesting that he also could make his way to the Warriors this offseason in free agency, along with Paul George via trade. Something to potentially monitor in terms of Patrick Beverley, maybe. Third fact here. Bill Simmons, I think the Bill Simmons podcast is the biggest NBA podcast, I would hazard a guess. It is for me anyway, and I'm sure, I don't know actually the numbers behind it, but everyone knows Bill Simmons. Everyone knows Bill. I'm sure everyone listens to the Bill Simmons podcast. It's a must listen. He and Ryan Russillo discussing specifically a Paul George move to the Warriors. They're the facts. Mark Stein, Bill Simmons, Pat Bev tweet. Sure, Pat Bev wouldn't tweet about it unless there was a hint that there was a chance that it might happen. Right? So let's get into more of the facts in terms of the financials of this, because it is hard to get your head around with this new second tax apron. And I'll be completely honest, I haven't got my head completely around it, but I'm going to, I've tried to get as much information and education into myself about this as I possibly can over the last few days, because the last thing I want to do is write something or say something on here that is factually incorrect and cannot happen kind of thing. So I want to try and educate myself as much as possible on this. I'm still trying to get my head around it. But here are the facts as I know them to be, at least. And if you want to try and correct me in the comments, you can. And I'll look more into it. But this is what I believe to be fact. The Warriors cannot trade for Paul George right now. So if you're expecting to see a trade for Paul George on draft day or draft night, for the Warriors, you will not see that. You will not see the Warriors trading for Paul George on draft night. You will not see Paul George traded to the Warriors in the next few days. That will not happen. The Warriors are a second apron team as of right now. Therefore, they cannot aggregate salaries to trade for Paul, or they can't aggregate salaries to trade for anyone, let alone Paul George. Therefore, the only way they could trade for Paul George, who's got a $48.8 million player option, is if they had another player making $48.8 million. They do not. Like, down to the very dollar. They do not have a player that's making exactly that much money. So they cannot trade for Paul George right now. It's worth noting that Clippers are also a second apron team as of right now. However, there will come a time in start of July, new cap year hits, where Klay Thompson will be an unrestricted free agent. James Harden will also be an unrestricted free agent. Therefore, both the Warriors and the Clippers will be under the second apron. That will allow the Warriors to therefore aggregate salaries and for a trade for Paul George to become foreseeable, a chance of happening, viable, realistic, right? In terms of the CBA rules. They're the facts. We've got to, if this is going to happen, we've got to wait, right, for this to happen. We've got to wait until July. This won't happen really for another week, you would say, if it was going to happen. In the meantime, Paul George could be traded to another team. The Knicks, for example, I don't think are a second apron team. They could aggregate salaries to trade for Paul George on draft night, a couple of days here. They could do something. Paul George, in the meantime, could also opt into his contract and say, I want to stay at the Clippers. That won't happen, I wouldn't have thought. The Clippers he could opt out and he could just re-sign with the Clippers and get his max deal or whatever, or 3 years, 152, same as Kawhi, whatever he wants. Like, he could just re-sign with the Clippers and that's that. So they're the other options on the table, I suppose, before the Warriors even have a chance, viably, of trading for Paul George. So, the hypotheticals of what a trade could look like. Just quickly, so Bill Simmons proposes on his recent podcast episode here that the Warriors trade Chris Paul, Gary Payton II, and Jonathan Kuminga for Paul George. The other thing I forgot to mention financially is because obviously Klay being an unrestricted free agent, the Warriors, this would be contingent on the Warriors letting Klay walk. So any trade hypothetical here you've also got to include the fact that Klay would be departing in this scenario. So it's almost like you've got to include Klay in the trade to see the overall value and landscape of it, if that makes sense. So it's contingent on Klay leaving, and then the Warriors obviously would have pushed, and this is the other thing. So we're not going to see a Paul George trade here in the next, it can't happen to the Warriors until July. But Chris Paul's guarantee date is the 28th of July. If Chris Paul and the Warriors mutually agree to push that date back into July, use your brain. That would be a hint that something might be on the horizon, that something's bound to happen. That would be the strongest suggestion that you're possibly going to get before July. Unless, of course, a reporter comes out and says, you know what, there's a big chance here that Paul George gets traded to the Warriors. If there's nothing, but you see that the Warriors and Chris Paul have moved his contract back, that's going to be a strong hint. Anyway, Simmons says CP, GP2, Kuminga, which again works once July hits, once the new cap year hits. That works financially. I guess the really big question is here, do we want to give up Kuminga? In a normal scenario, maybe. But this is not a normal scenario. This is a scenario to me where the Warriors should be pushing incredibly hard to get Paul George for below market rate. And what I mean by that is Paul George threatening to opt out and leave as a free agent if he doesn't get traded, and specifically probably to the Warriors. He needs to push for that because all of a sudden the Clippers are kind of up against the wall in a tight spot, thinking, okay, what do we do? Do we potentially lose this guy for nothing, lose the salary spot completely, get no assets in return? Or do we trade him, keep the salary, and potentially get an asset or something back? So, again, this is where, like, Kuminga would be that asset, and that would make sense. And so I think that's a perfectly viable trade scenario from Bill Simmons. I think just if the Warriors need to be ruthless about this, and I think if I was them, I would say no. Because I think I personally am going to have a hard enough time giving up Klay for Paul George, because, again, this is contingent on Klay's got to leave and then PG comes in. I would have a hard enough time. I know PG's objectively a better player than Klay Thompson right now. It would be an upgrade. It would be better for the team. I understand that. And I think at the end of the day, I'd be okay. But of course, like, Klay leaving is going to make, like, he's my favorite of play. That's going to make me emotional. And so I'm going to be torn apart a bit there. But I'd be okay with it. All of a sudden, I'd start to be less okay with it if you're letting Klay walk out the door and you're also trading your best young asset in Kuminga. Then I'm going to start, is it really worth it kind of thing. So if I'm the Warriors, I've got to be ruthless and say, no, I'm not giving up Jonathan Kuminga in this deal. So, of course, like, the Warriors could do CP, GP2 and Loon, right? Clippers going to go for that? Probably not. Even if PG says, no, I want to be traded to the Warriors, Clippers, again, will say, well, hang on, mate, you opted into your contract. Like, we're not bound to do anything by you. So that offer, probably not. So here's where I get into my trade proposal that I had on bluemanhoop.com. Three-team deal here between the Warriors, Clippers, and Trailblazers that I proposed, as I said, on bluemanhoop.com earlier today. It would see PG go to the Warriors, obviously. It would see Jeremy Grant, GP2, and Loon head to the Clippers. And it would be CP3, 2027 first-round pick from the Warriors, and 2029 and 2030 second-round picks from the Warriors go to the Trailblazers. Let's unpack that for a second from all three sides. The Warriors absolutely do it in a heartbeat. There's no doubt about that. There's absolutely no doubt that the Warriors do that trade where they give up GP2, Loon, CP3, a 2027 first, and 2029 and 2030 second-round picks for Paul George. You'd make that trade. I know you've got to give up, like, one of your future picks, and that pick could actually be good. 2027, you're talking about Steph Curry being 39 years old. You're talking about Draymond Green being 37 years old. You're talking about Paul George being 37 years old. You do that trade, though, regardless. Okay? Absolute win-now deal, and it's worth it. Because guess what? You keep Jonathan Kuminga, you keep Brandon Podziemski, you keep Trayce Jackson-Davis, you keep Moses Moody. The four guys that are at the core of your young talent. And you've still got picks to utilize, and you've still got Andrew Wiggins. Here's what the Warrior roster would actually look like with that trade going down. It would be Steph, PG, Wiggs, JK, Draymond. So that could be your starting five. Pods, TJD, Moody, Guy Santos, who's got a non-guaranteed deal for next season at very cheap money. Warriors could utilize him in a trade or waive him if need be. But that's 9 players that in total are just under the first apron. So the first tax apron is $179 million, I believe, for next season. Those 9 players equate to 175, about that. So that's not bad. Again, Steph, PG, Wiggs, JK, Draymond, pretty good 5. Pods, TJD, decent. Moody could step into a bigger role. And that's before we get to draft and free agency, where the Warriors would obviously have limited financial flexibility in free agency. But if you could go and get Paul George, maybe you lure a good free agent or 2 on minimum chips. Who knows? You're going to have the 52nd overall pick at the draft. Maybe you can try and get another version of Trayce Jackson-Davis that can step right in and play a role straight away. Who knows? I think that's a pretty good roster to start with ahead of draft and free agency. Now, from the Clippers and the Trailblazers side of things, it's obviously a lot different. It's not a such a winning trade for them, that's for sure. The Clippers, again, would have to be incentivized that, okay, we could lose PG for nothing. He's obviously opted in. Let's make sure we get something here. You keep the salary open, so you've just traded for the equivalent salary in Jeremy Grant, GP2, and Loon. And you've got a guy in Jeremy Grant who no one's saying is as good as Paul George, but he's an above-average starting forward. He's 4 years younger. He's under contract for another 4 years. The contract's weird because I don't think the Trailblazers should have given it to him by any means, given the direction they're going. However, it's not some albatross contract where you're like, no one wants to borrow that. Like, that's an horrific deal by any means. Like, it's not. It's, $30 million a year, which in the coming years, like, that's fine now, really. And then even more so in the coming years with the cap going up and up, like, that's going to be fine. It's a fine contract. It's okay. It's not great value. It's not bad value. It's fine. And so that allows you to remain competitive, I think, in the Western Conference with Kawhi Leonard. You can try and re-sign James Harden. I think they'd still be able to do that. Still have some trade. Maybe they try and move GP2 and Loon. I don't know. The other factor to all of this as I move into the Trailblazers is that assuming CP3 went to Portland, you'd imagine that they would waive him straight away, probably. Now, there's a way in which they could keep him and use him as a mentor for Scoot Henderson, which makes some sense, and maybe they have him for half a season and then they try and see if they can get anything for him at the mid-season trade deadline, see if there's a team out there that's chasing a veteran point guard for ahead of the playoffs. Who knows? And maybe they try and get an asset for him. I think the most likely scenario is that he would be waived, right? Which then could mean that, hang on, we've had reports that the Lakers and the Clippers would be interested if CP is a free agent. Well, then maybe the Clippers could orchestrate a way here if they think that the Trailblazers are going to waive Chris Paul, that they actually get CP3 kind of in this deal as well, and they pay him the minimum or taxpayer mid-level exception, whatever they've got access to for Chris Paul. So they actually end up with Chris Paul in this deal as well, kind of, as a afterthought following the trade. So that would leave, essentially, for the Trailblazers, you're incentivized by the idea of, hey, we're going to full rebuilding mode. We need to be one of these teams that are young, giving opportunity to our young guys on the floor, but also off the floor, having full financial flexibility moving forward. And having Jeremy Grant under contract for another 4 years doesn't offer them that. And that was always the issue with this trade with this deal, is that you sign him to a 5-year, $160 million contract when you are literally just starting a rebuild. I think they did it like a couple of days before they traded Damian Lillard. And now you got all these guys, Anthony Simons, who could also be moved, but obviously Scoot, Shaden Sharp. Don't know what's going to happen with Ayton. They're going to have picks in the future. They are in rebuild mode. So you want to try and have the financial flexibility that some of the other younger teams are going to have, like the Magic have right now, albeit they're in a slightly different spot because they took a massive jump this season. The Spurs are going to have as well moving forward to try and find the perfect piece to pair with Wemby when the right time comes. Could be this offseason with Darius Garland, could be next season, year after, whatever it may be. Like the Thunder as well, where they, even though they've won the Western Conference in the regular season this year, they have cap space still as such a young team. So that is what the Trailblazers should want. Financial flexibility to go out, and once these young guys develop, go and specifically pick at what they need on the trade market or in free agency, and not be limited by what they have at their availability financially. So that would be the incentive here, right? Because otherwise, you'd think you'd probably get more in this deal. You'd probably think you'd get more in a different deal than this one if you're the Trailblazers for a guy of Jeremy Grant's caliber. Because ultimately, if you're waiving Chris Paul, all you're getting is a 2027 first, 2029 and 2030 second round picks. Again, I'll go back. That 2027 first could be good, right? Could be Warriors are crap. Could be top 10. And therefore, if it's top 10, that's probably fair value for Jeremy Grant. It actually is. But again, you're taking a risk that, hang on, maybe the Warriors are still good. Maybe it's a pick outside the lottery. Maybe it's pick 25, and therefore it's not good value for Jeremy Grant. I think the Trailblazers would probably want a bit more guarantee in those future assets than what they would ultimately get in this pick, not knowing, obviously, 3 years down the line where the Warriors will be. It's not horrific. Like, I saw another one on Rip City Project that the trade proposal was Bruce Brown, a 2028 pick swap with the Raptors, and another second-round pick. So if you just remove the second-round picks, I'm actually saying 2 second-round picks, so that's worth more than 1 second-round pick. Bruce Brown's certainly worth more than Chris Paul, no doubting that, but then the 2027 first-round pick from the Warriors would be more valuable, I'd imagine, than a pick swap from the Raptors. So it's, again, if you're a Trailblazers fan watching this, let me know in the comments. I'm happy for you to be scathing at what I'm saying right now. I think it's unlikely that they would agree to that trade, but there's a chance. It's in the realm of possibility. Let's put it that way. Again, I would say it's unlikely, but it's not that far off the mark, I don't think. And maybe you can work something else out to try and get this deal over the line. But that is what I would do because, again, you're getting in Paul George while retaining all 4 of your young players, and you are you still got Andrew Wiggins you could potentially use as a trade piece to go. Like, there was a bit of interest with Milwaukee at the trade deadline for Wiggins in February. Could you go to the Bucks and say, interested in Brook Lopez? Do you want to do a Lopez-Wiggins swap? Warriors, again, might have to throw in a pick, given Wiggins has still got a few years left on his contract and Lopez is on expiring. Maybe you think about a deal like that. Again, the Warriors would still have some picks to play with after this trade. But I just think they've got to be ruthless and say, you know what, we're really interested in Paul George. We want that guy. But we're also trading for him knowing that, okay, he's got 1 year left on his deal. He could walk at the end of next year if he wanted to. Therefore, we don't want to give up that many assets. If he doesn't walk, we're going to have to pay him big money to retain him. And right now, LA, you're in a bit of a tight spot here. He could walk for nothing in free agency. Here's what we have to offer, and it's not inclusive of Jonathan Kuminga, Brandon Podziemski, Trace Jackson-Davis, or Moses Moody. At a stretch, like, if you got to give up Moody, then okay, but then the money doesn't actually, I don't think the money quite works if you substitute like GP2 out or Loon out for Moody. I don't think the Warriors quite get there. Maybe it's like Moody and Guy Santos. I don't know. It gets all complicated. We know this time of year brings up all these hypothetical scenarios that will most likely not play out, but it's fun to talk about regardless, and it's interesting to acknowledge and understand the possibilities that are at play here. And I think it is important to talk about. And at the end of the day, we've got factual information here that Paul George is being linked to the Warriors from Mark Stein, Pat Beff tweeting about it, Bill Simmons mentioning it on his podcast. I think I'll finish it up there. Another pretty big episode. Like, these are, big times here for the Warriors, not just for their short-term future next season, but obviously moving forward with all the young players that they've got at their disposal and whether they're willing to give those guys up or not. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me on X/Twitter at POK252. That's POK252. And I reckon next episode, I might do an episode after the first round of the NBA draft, because the draft is split up into 2 nights. Might do an episode after the first night where the Warriors shouldn't have any action going on because they don't have a first round pick. And then we'll do an episode then kind of looking at that 52nd pick, what the Warriors could possibly get. And there's bound to be trades involving other teams, so I can do a few, give my thoughts on that as well. Of course, in the meantime, if there is something big involving the Warriors, I'm sure I'll jump on and talk about it. Otherwise, you can, of course, find my content on bluemanhoop.com as well. Other than that, guys, I'll see you in the next episode.